Okay, fall is in full swing. That means it's time to start thinking about spring color and specifically planting bulbs now to ensure that we have lots of color come early spring next year. Okay, so right now we're thinking about spring color, and typically that is bulbs. Bulbs are the easiest way to ensure that you're going to have a good blast of color come early March, April, depending on when we start warming up. Now, there's lots of different bulbs. Now, there's two different categories. There are the ones that we plant in the fall, typically for spring color, and then there's ones we plant in spring for summer color. Right now, we are talking specifically fall bulbs to ensure we have lots of color. That would be tulips, crocus, daffodils. But I also have a little hint right now for my dahlia lovers. Anybody that planted dahlias this spring and like to overwinter them, I'll be talking at the very end about how to kind of get your dahlias to bloom 2 to 3 weeks early next year. But you got to watch to the end. All right, so anybody that hasn't planted bulbs, this is typically the way you would purchase them. We carry them in all different sizes and all different stocks and colors. And these are the individual bulbs. The hardest part when planting bulbs is trying to determine which side to plant them, up or down. Specifically, some of them like tulips are nice and easy because right at the bottom you could see the roots. So that's going to want to be down, and you point that up. Now, the rule of thumb I've always applied, when you look at the package, it'll tell you how deep to plant the bulbs based on what you're planting. My rule of thumb is I plant 2 to 3 inches, 2 to 3 times the size of the bulb. So if I've got a big tulip bulb that's an inch or so across, I'm putting it down 3 or 4 inches down. And so if I have a little baby bulb like a crocus, those little bulbs are only small, I'm only planting them down an inch or so. So that's a good rule of thumb. But everything you need to know on bulbs is typically right on the package. Once you determine what color plants and what flowers you want, the most important thing is when they're going to bloom. Because even though we look at say these tulips right near the daffodils, and you might be picking and says, oh, I like this flower next to these. The reality is most of these are only going to be blooming for a couple weeks. And so you have to really watch the timing, because what we're trying to do is get a succession of flowers, something that's going to flower early spring, mid-spring, late spring, so that we get 4, 6, 8 weeks of bulbs, flowers. But these daffodils are not going to be blooming at the same time as these tulips. So how do we narrow this down is by looking at the corners. So these are crocus, and these are going to be early spring. And so we're watching these for early spring, and then you'll see some others that say mid-spring. Now, there's lots of other information on here, if they're bee-friendly or deer-resistant, what kind of sun or light they need. But most importantly is going to be the flower time, because as you're laying these things out and trying to make a pattern and make sure the garden is going to look good when they're in bloom, you want to be gauging in your color patterns based on when they're going to be blooming. So that's easy to do. Now, one of my favorite bulbs is actually these alliums, and these plants, if you've read any of the catalogs or seen any bulb catalogs, they always have these pictures because these are massive. And they come in all different shapes and sizes from light pink to white. But this is more of a late spring, early summer flower. So this is nice for color later in the season. And we've gotten in some beautiful giant alliums, and these things just grow up, and you can plop these in because the plant itself does not take up a lot of room. It just sends up this little stem that goes all the way up, and then you get these giant balls of flower on the tail end. So they'll pop up well above all your daffodils and all your perennials as they're starting to bloom. But bulbs are pretty easy because the flower is actually already inside this bulb. So just waiting to go. So you have almost no risk in ensuring that the first year you're going to be getting flowers. Okay, so one of the biggest things I love doing bulbs for is because it takes all the guesswork out of it. They're foolproof for the first season. And what that means is when you're reading bulbs on there's going to be lots of little spots that say what kind of sunlight it needs. We're going through. Doesn't really matter the first year. The flower is already in there. So I can take something that wants to be in full sun, I can stick it in full shade, and the first spring, I'm still going to get flowers. However, if I want that plant to rebloom and come back year after year and keep progressing, then it's more important to pay attention to where you're putting it and treat it like any other plant. The rule of thumb is, though, in the spring, when daffodils and tulips are blooming, once the flower's gone by, the plants can start looking pretty ugly. And many times they're in wrong locations compared to where your perennials are in your garden, because when you're planting these, you're typically going around in between your existing perennials or your shrubs and trying to stick these in the ground. So you kind of have to deal with it for a little bit come early spring once it starts going, because you need to go through and kind of just take those things out, let the plants go, and do not pick them and do not let them flare away. What you want to do is let them kind of shrivel up and dry on their own. What they're doing by doing that is they're going through and they're blocking it out. Okay, so that's what I get for hiring kids. Specifically my own. Anyway, when we're trying to deal with bulbs, they're the easiest plant to work with. Just think about your garden now. Think about where you want to splash a color. Figure out the color patterns you want, and then put them in there. Let the plant grow out, fertilize it, treat it just like any other flower, any other perennial. And it's going to come back multiple seasons and usually give you more and more flowers each year. So that's the key, plant them properly. Now, some of the other bulbs that we have, it's the dahlias. Dahlias are one of the plants that we plant in the spring, and I want to show you a trick. And I'm going to try to get some visuals of this. I don't know how it's going to come out, but I'm going to tell you now an old tale that I've been told 25 years ago, but I've never tested it myself, but makes complete sense. So what that is, dahlias. If you planted your dahlias this fall, many times you can pull the bulbs out, just like canna. They're not hardy around here. It's a flowering bulb, but it just grows into almost like a bush sometimes, and they're just flowering machines. Mine is still kicking out flowers, except for just the other day we got our first frost. Now the plant is all burned out. So what we want to do with dahlias is let them get this first frost, but don't chalk off the plant. Yes, it'll die if the ground freezes, but the ground is still warm. So what's going to happen is the whole top of the plant is going to bleed out, meaning like it turns to mush. You could tell it just got a hard frost. And then at that point, when you look down at the very bottom of the plant, you can usually see some little growing points that are down there. With the weather pattern around here, over the next couple weeks, it's going to try to revert. So the top parts of the plant are burned. You can cut those right off. And what's going to happen is at the very bottom, you're going to start seeing the growing points come out again. And it's already formed new growth buds for next season. At that point, once you see the new buds starting to form, don't wait until they open and start putting out leaves. The minute the new buds are forming, cut the top of the plant off, leave those buds there, dig the plant right out, shake all the soil off the roots, and store it that way. And so dahlias and cannas can be stored in peat moss or any other dry conditions over the winter time, and divide those out and replant them again next year. They're very hardy bulbs to do this with. But the key is, if you're getting those little buds on there, it's doing all the legwork for next year. So it'll get a little leggy in spring, but it'll flower 2 to 3 weeks earlier for you next year than it did this year. And that's just a little trick with dahlias that I've been taught. I've done it once or twice, haven't done it a lot. Hopefully it works for you. Take care and hope that helps.